histories. We are going to look at the 4 key histories: the history of the beginning of ancient Israel and the end of ancient Israel, the beginning and the end of modern Israel. If we look at these 4 histories, God opened things in a particular order, because the history of the end of ancient Israel, it is almost similar or identical to our history. This history of the end of ancient Israel, our history, it is typified by this history, because so many things that we saw that were going to happen in our history is because of this history. We understood about the first group called the Atlas of Probation, the shaking and all of that. It was because of this history of the end of ancient Israel. It shows that it reveals things that were going to happen in our history. And what we did after, we applied the rule of parable methodology of comparing and contrasting. So when we compare and contrast ancient and modern Israel, we see that ancient Israel, it is coming out of pagan nations. Modern Israel, it is coming out of Protestantism. So if we were following that study of A.P. Spool, we saw that ancient Israel upheld idolatry in such a way it was very difficult for them to let go of idolatry. Up until the end of 490, they were still in idolatry. So I'm gonna read a verse during the time of Solomon, when God warns them about worshiping other gods. So during the time of Solomon in the Old Testament, we find where God tells them that if they turn away and forsake my statutes and my commandment, which I've set before you, and shall go and serve other gods and worship them, then will I pluck them up by the roots out of the land which I have given them. And this house which I have sanctified for my name will I cast out of my sight, and I will make it to be a proverb and a byword amongst all nations. And this house which is high shall be an astonishment to everyone that passeth by it, so that he shall say, why hath the Lord done thus unto this land and unto this house? And it shall be answered, because they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, which brought them out of the land of Egypt, and lay hold on other gods and worship them and serve them. Therefore had he brought all this evil upon them. So what we find here is that the Lord is warning them that if they turn away, right, turn away from him, forsake his statutes and his commandment, then he will pluck them out, right? So he will cast them out of his sight. So this thing, it was fulfilled when they were taken into captivity in Babylon, because they were still in idolatry, worshiping graven image. So it was also fulfilled in the history of the end of ancient Israel. They were still in idolatry. So I'm gonna read something from Ellen G. White. It says, considering the children of Israel not for others, but for themselves, did they minister. God created them to live in a world where unselfish service must be performed. But in the place of doing this, they grasp everything for themselves. Their eye is so large that they cannot see anything else. They are not in touch with the suffering humanity. Christ came to show them the way of life, but they were determined to walk in their own selfish way, and the Lord gave them up as they joined to their idols. So what we find here is that Christ came in this history of the end of ancient Israel. He tried to show them a way of life, but they continue to walk in their own selfish way, right? So the Lord gave them up because they were so joined into the idolatry. Are we following? So that is the ancient Israel. So if we read Leviticus 26, Leviticus 26, it says, ye shall make no idol, no graven image, neither rear you up a standing image, neither shall ye set up any image of stone in your land to bow down unto it, for I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my Sabbath and reference my sanctuary. I am the Lord. So what we find here, we find two things. God tells them that they should what? Not make any graven image, and they should keep the Sabbath. They should reference the sanctuary. If they do that, if they walk according to his statutes, then he will what? He will bless them. But if they do the opposite of that, continue in idolatry, not keeping the Sabbath, not referencing the sanctuary, then he will curse them. But that history of ancient Israel, they were cursed, right? Because 70 AD, we see that God destroyed them because they were still in idolatry. But in this history of the end of Israel, it is very hard to see that they are still in idolatry, because there is no any golden calf that is set up in Jerusalem, or it appears like they are keeping the Sabbath, they are referencing the sanctuary, but they were still in idolatry. How? So if you look at their history, the history of the end of ancient Israel and even their fractal. So this is the line of the first group called the disciples. They were called by Christ. He taught them, then he died. He died, then he resurrected, he went back to the disciple, and the disciple approached him and they asked him, when will he set up a new kingdom? And they asked him, are you going to overthrow the Romans now? So what we find here is that they don't understand the nature of a king and the nature of a kingdom. They are looking for a new kingdom that Christ is going to set up. So the problem with them is their mindset. They are looking for that king, the episcopal king, the character of an episcopal, that spirit of a king with a fighting spirit, a conquering spirit. They thought that Christ was going to conquer the Romans. So Christ had to reteach them what he had already taught them, right? He was not teaching anything new. So even after their close of probation, because at the cross it was the close of their probation, but they still don't understand so many things. And this last dispensation, it was the dispensation of their harvest, but they were still in darkness, not understanding the nature of a king and a kingdom. That is how we can see how idolatry, it was so deep in such a way, it was very hard for them to uproot it. So the problem, it was their mindset. They were expecting that conquering king was going to overthrow the Romans. So the cross, we parallel it with 2019. So from 1989 to 2019, this is 30 years, right? This is 30 years of training, but still we have the same problem like the disciple. Even after the training, we still don't understand so many things that were taught in previous dispensation. Just like them, Christ had to teach them what he had already taught them. So the problem, it was their mindset, and the problem, it is still the mindset when it comes to our history. So we have to remember that the third wave of feminism, they are fighting against what? Against people's mindset, right? They want to uproot, whether it's sexism, patriarchy, nationalism, xenophobia, all those things, whether homophobic, it is rooted where? In their mind, in people's mind, our mindset. So it's the same thing when we look at this history of the end of ancient Israel and we parallel it with our history, we can see that they didn't understand what Christ taught them. Is still the same with us. After 2019, we still don't understand the studies that were taught, for the fact that we are reviewing the presentation that were presented, and we are realizing now that there's a lot of information in those presentations and we didn't see that. So I hope by going back, we will understand. So it was the same problem with them. And the problem, it was their mindset. So they were still in idolatry. Being in idolatry, the end of ancient Israel, it doesn't mean they were bowing down to the sun god or the pagan god. They were not doing that. But the problem, it was their mindset. Same with us. It doesn't mean we are going to church on Sunday like the Protestant. No, we are not doing that. But we have the same mindset with them. Are you following so far?
Yes.
So, okay, I will look at the history of the colonies when they arrived in America. I want us to go to that history and look at what happened during that time when the colonies were arriving in USA. So when you look at the history of the Millerites, it started in 1798 all the way until 1863. So this is 65 years according to 2520. So Christ was supposed to come in 1863 if they were faithful. But we know that Christ didn't come. And in that history, there's 1850. 1850, it was their Sunday law. This is the history of the Millerites. 1850, it was their Sunday law. So 1798, we see a lamb like this rising into power, and it has two horns. So those two horns, according to this study, I know there's a different view about two horns. So according to this study, those two horns represented Protestantism and Republicanism. And those horns were supposed to be broken in before 1863, before the returning of Christ. So yeah, according to this study, I can say the subject of horns, when we look at this presentation, I can say it was simplicity. We know that we moved from simplicity to complex. So according to this study, those horns represent Protestantism and Republicanism, and they were supposed to be broken before the second coming of Christ. So I'm just gonna go way back prior to 1798. In the year 1619. So I will read what happened in 1619 when the colonies arrived in USA. But are we following so far? So it says, two momentous events happened in Britain fledgling colony in Virginia. The New World's first democratic assembly convened, and an English privateer brought kidnapped Africans to sell as slaves. Such were the conflicted origin of modern Africa. In the newly built Church of Jamestown, Virginia, the General Assembly, the first gathering of representative governing body in America, came together. A few weeks later, a battered privateer entered the Chesapeake Bay carrying the first American slave to land on mainland English America. So when these colonies arrive in the United States, we see two things. We see the beginning of the democratic government, and we also see the introduction of Britain's slavery in America. So two things in 1619, the beginning of democratic government and the introduction of slave in America. So I'm just gonna put the issue of slaves aside. I will come back to it. I want us to see this government that was beginning in 1619. So I will read here. Following the instruction from the Virginia Company of London, the colony's financial backer, the meeting principal proposal was to introduce just law for the happy guiding and governing of people. So these colonies, they had a meeting. They wanted to introduce laws, and they called those laws happy laws, right? So those laws were supposed to guide and govern people. The assembly set a single body and was made up of the governor, Sir George Yeardley, his 4 councillors, and 22 burgesses chosen by the free white male inhabitants of every town, corporation, and large plantation throughout the colony. The representative who gathered for the initial meeting of the first representative assembly in the New World dealt extensively with the subject of religion. The very first order of business for this group of the leading Virginians was a prayer. Later in this session, legislation was passed relating to religious expression that makes clear the extensive ties between church and state. In the early years of settlement, according to historian Perry Miller, the assembly enacted a series of religious laws that are a match for anything to be found in Puritan society. So from the beginning of this democratic government, what we see here, we see that they are enacting laws, right? Religious laws. They call those laws the laws that will govern people. So from the beginning, we see the union of what? Of church and state. Are we following?
Yeah.
Yeah, so from the beginning of that government, we see the union of church and state. So I'm just going to give the example of those laws that they enacted in 1619. So one of those laws, it was written, all person whatsoever upon Sabbath day shall frequent divine service and sermons, both before noon and afternoon, and all such as bear arms shall bring their pieces, sword, powder, and shot, and everyone that shall transgress this law shall forfeit 3 shillings a time to the use of the church, all lawful and necessary impediment accepted. So anyone who will break the Sabbath or will not want to keep the Sabbath, there's going to be fine. They had to pay. So this is one of those laws that they enacted. So, and another thing, okay, from that beginning of democratic government in the United States, yeah, we see the combination of church and state. So yeah, they are enforcing what? Sunday law observance. So punishment by fine for those who don't want to attend, who don't want to attend the church, right? They were supposed they were going to fine them, or punishment with bodily inaction for any servant. So if the servant doesn't want to attend the church, doesn't want to listen to the command of his master, and doesn't want to attend the church, there were going to be a bodily punishment. For heresy will lead to the most severe sentence, banishment, being forced to leave the colony. A banished individual banished for heresy, caught returning to the settlement, will be put to death. So for heresy, you were forced to leave what? To leave the colony. If you returned, then you were going to be killed. For blasphemy, this is a major crime, blasphemy. Okay, there will be sentence for whipping to the pillory, which is essentially the type of stock, have a hole made in their tongue with a red hot iron, or stand for a period of time on the gallows with the rope around their neck. So for blaspheming, they were going to open a hole in your tongue with the red hot iron, or hang a rope around your neck for blasphemy. So these were the laws that they were enacting, this government that is rising in 1690, or just breaking their Sabbath, of which it was Sunday. So other laws punish colonists for not properly observing the Sabbath. Sunday observes a day of rest and worshiping, skipping religious services. Some colonial laws even ban traveling on Sunday. So even to travel on Sunday, other colonies, they ban that. All right. So these Sunday laws were existing in all the colonies. So what we see here is that from the very beginning of this government, the establishment of this government, we see what? Sunday law and what? And slavery. So in 1850, we mark it as the Fugitive Act slave, right? Fugitive Slave Act, but it was first enacted not in 1850. It was first enacted in 17 1793. The Fugitive Act slave, it was first enacted in 1718. So I'm just gonna read what it says, that Fugitive Slave Act. We marked it in 1850, but it was first enacted in 1793. So it said, in 1793, the first fugitive slaves was enacted by the Congress, regarding all states, including those states that forbid slavery, to forcibly return slaves who have escaped from the state of their original owners. So 1793, that law, it was forcing all states, even those who don't want to participate in slavery. So that law, it was written like this: no person held the service of labor in one state under the law thereof, escaping into another, shall in no consequences of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such labor or service, but shall be delivered up on the claims of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. So we can see that it was there in 1793. Before 1850, there was a Fugitive Slave Act. Are we following so far?
Yeah.
Yeah, but things started to change when there was American Revolution. Things started to change because the union of church and state, it was so deep in such a way that it was difficult. It was difficult to separate that union. So in 1776, we will read about what happened in 1776 in all those states, those 13 states. So in each and every state, the office holders of each and every state, they were supposed to profess their Protestant faith. They were supposed to profess their Protestant faith. For example, the state will say, our state church is Methodist Church or Presbyterian Church. So each state, it was supposed to profess their Protestant faith, whether they are Methodist or Presbyterian or Baptist. So yeah, but in 1833, there was a change. So that relationship of church and state started to fade. So in 1833, we understand that it is a big waymark. If we look at the history of the Millerites, 1833, it is a waymark, a significant waymark. So what I'm doing is just looking at the external events and the internal event. So in 1833, external, what happened? So externally, the Massachusetts stopped supporting an official religious denomination in 1833. It was the final last state to do so. So in 1833, Massachusetts stopped supporting religious denomination, and it was the last state to do so. So in 1833, the final of those 13 states stopped supporting an official religious denomination. So yeah, all those 13 states stopped supporting religious denomination. And that process of separating church and state, they call it gradual process or disestablishment, when they were separating church and state in 1833. So 1798, Ellen G. White will tell you that USA is rising into power. But if we follow the studies of Act 27, it teaches us that there are two institutions that is rising into power: the United States and the SDA. In 1798, two institutions rising into power: SDA and USA. So, but when this institution rise into power, there's a problem about these two institutions, right? In 1798, we know that Seventh-day Adventists, it is raised as a movement. So 1798, we are still in confusion. We are still worshiping on Sunday. William Miller is still a teenager, not even started to study the Bible. We don't understand the prophecies. That was in 1798 when this movement arose. So it's the same thing with the USA in 1798. It is still coming to 1798 with all this baggage from 1619, the relationship of church and state, slavery, fugitive acts, and all of that. It is coming with that baggage to 1798. So both of these two institutions, they were supposed to learn and unlearn. Are we following?
Yes.
Yeah. They were supposed to learn and unlearn. So when they were both rising into power in 1798. So in 1833, like I've said, that Masuki said it was the last state to separate, to stop supporting the church. So in 1798, there's an increase of knowledge, but it is a progressive increase of knowledge, right? It is the progressive increase of knowledge. So in 1833, internally, they are having this progressive light, the increase of knowledge. Even them, they are having this progressive light because we see that they are beginning to separate church and state. This establishment, that's the separation of church and state. That's what they did. So who played that role of separating church and state? Who were involved in playing that role of separating church and state? If you read the books of A.T. Jones, he will tell us that it was Thomas Jefferson and James Madison who did that work of separating church and state. So the term of separating church and state, I've said it, that they call it disestablishment. Disestablishment, it means the removing of religious organization from the state establishment. So yeah, that term, they use that term, disestablishment. So Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, it was them who did that work of separating church and state. So I'm just gonna quote here. It says, many political leaders, including Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, favored this establishment because they saw the relationship between church and state as a tool of oppression. Jefferson proposed a statute for religious freedom in Virginia State Assembly in 1779. So Thomas Jefferson and Madison, they saw that the relationship of church and state, it is a tool of oppression. So he proposed that they should separate in 1779 in Virginia, the separation of church and state. So Jefferson in 1779, he proposed that there should be separation of church and state, right? But this bill failed. The reason that bill failed is because Anglican Church had so much power within the Protestant government of Virginia. So it was because of the Anglican Church. It has so much power in the government of Virginia. So that attempt of separating church and state in 1779 failed because of that power that Anglican had. So Madison in 1785, he proposed it again, right? A rival bill that would have given equal revenue to all Protestant churches, right? That's what he did. Instead, they decided that Virginia would not use public money to support religion. So they said Virginia will not use what public money to support what to support a religion. So Jefferson wrote, the religion then of every man must be left to the conviction of conscience of every man, and it is the right of every man to exercise it as this may indicate. So that's what Jefferson said, that everyone should exercise what religious liberty, right? That's what he wrote that. So A.T. Jones says that the formers of the Constitution understood that separation of church and state and liberty of conscience was a result of Reformation. So the separation of church and state and religious liberty, it is what they understood that it was a Reformation. Are we still together?
Yes, Dimakatso.
Yeah, so they understand it is a reformation. And Madison and Jefferson, the champion of the separation of church and state in the Constitutional Convention, which framed the Constitution, said. So A.T. Jones called Madison and Jefferson that they're the champion of separating what church and state. So yeah, that was the work that was done by Madison and Jefferson of separating church and state. So it will continue A.T. Jones to quote Jefferson, where he said, in a struggle which resulted in establishing the church in the colony, and from which struggle they came to the National Convention. So what Jefferson did, he started by separating church and state in Virginia, then he went to National Convention to write it in a bill later. Jefferson would say, we would also humbly present the only proper object of civil government are the happiness and protection of men in the present of status of existence. So what he wanted, it was the protection and the happiness of men. That was Jefferson. So he also continued quoting where Jefferson, quoting what Jefferson said. He said, illustrate and confirm this ascension, we beg leave to observe that to judge for ourselves and to engage in the exercise of religious agreeably to the dictates of our own conscience is an inalienable right, which upon the principle of which the gospel was first propagated and the reformation from popery carried on can never be transferred to another. So what he said is that what happened to 1060, he doesn't want it to happen, which means during their history, right? So people should exercise, should worship God according to the dictates of their conscience. That's what he said. The same thing that happened during 1260 doesn't want that to transfer to other histories. That is why he was separating church and state. Hello. So Thomas Jefferson and Madison was the forerunner of the First Amendment protecting the religious freedom. So the First Amendment, it was done by Jefferson and Madison protecting religious freedom. So Thomas Jefferson, before he died, he said, he left instruction of 3 things that he wanted to inscribe in his grave epitaph. Oh, my phone is off. So before he died, he wanted 3 things to be inscribed in his grave. The first of those things is that he set Virginia free, right? He separated Virginia from that relationship of church and state. That's one of the things that he wanted to be ascribed in his grave. So Thomas Jefferson, we can see that he understood that the relationship of church and state, it was a way of oppressing other people. So he wanted that to be ascribed in his grave. So we continue. Anyone wants to add something? Hello? But are we following so far? Hello?
Yes, we are.
Oh, okay. So we'll continue. So yeah, one of the things that we wanted to be remembered about is that Virginia, he set Virginia free. So he wanted that to be written on his grave. And Thomas Jefferson, it was the only president in United States who didn't proclaim any day of Thanksgiving, because he understood that that day of Thanksgiving, it was when it was proclaimed, they were supposed to pray and fast. So he was the only president who didn't do that, because even Obama did that. So he became a president in 1800. In 1801, he received a letter from a Danbury Baptist Association. So Danbury Baptist Association, it has concern, right? Because in their state, the state of Connecticut, the state constitution did not protect the religious liberty of people who were living there at Connecticut. So we have to remember that in Connecticut, if we are following those studies, the study of the idolatry of conservatism, Connecticut, that's where we find the clergy. The clergy is under Gerard Morse, those conservative clergy. And even that study of contraceptive and the Supreme Court, if you read about Connecticut, it was a crime. You were going to be sentenced or you were going to be fined for just sharing information about contraceptive. It because most of those conservative clergy were there. So here, Connecticut, we can see that it doesn't want to protect the religious freedom of people who are staying there. So they wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson addressing that. And he continued to state that people should be free to worship God according to the way they want. And yeah, there must be a separation of church and state. That's what he responded in that way. And like I've said, that he was the only president who didn't participate in Thanksgiving. So Thomas Jefferson, he was hated by the fundamentalists because of that, because he was separating church and state. So he is the only president in US history who has not, from the office of president, proclaimed the day of Thanksgiving. So all of them, they did except him. It was a religious holiday, but he didn't proclaim that. So yes, he didn't do that. So if we go back to 1619, USA, those colonies, there was nothing like lamp like in 1619, because from the beginning of that government, they were already participating in slavery. So there was nothing like lamp like during that time. So when we follow Acts 27, when it talks about these two institutions, it will say that they will go of course, right? That ship, it will go what? Of course. So in 1850, during the history of the Millerites, when they were enforcing that law of Fugitive Slave Act, they were enforcing something that was already there, something that was existing. What they did, they were just enforcing it. In 1793, that law, it was not enforced, but in 1850, they enforced that law. So it's the same thing in 1888. They did the same. They were just enforcing what was already there, what was already existing, because it was written in the books. So they were just enforcing what was already there, written in the books. So yeah, that's what happened. If we follow the study of X27, is that ship will go of course, and we know that it will shipwreck both Adventism and USA. So if we look at the application, the triple application, it tells us that 1 plus 2 is equals to 3. So we can say the history of 1850, before we arrive there in that history of 1850, the triple application, we know that World War I plus World War II is equals to World War III. First War plus Second War is equals to Third War. So that history of 1850, you can say 1850 plus 1888, it is equals to our Sunday law. So the reason we are studying, we are looking at the beginning of the modern Israel, because if we want to understand our Sunday law, we cannot understand it fully by focusing on that history of the end of ancient Israel. Yes, the history of the end of ancient Israel, it is almost identical to our history. But when we want to understand about the Sunday law, we have to go to the beginning of modern Israel. That's where we'll understand so many things, how our Sunday law is going to be like. So if we take that history of 1850, the history of 1888, we will understand even our Sunday law, how our Sunday law is going to look like. So that history of 1850, you can find it in early writing, where she talks about Sins of Babylon, Ellen G. White, Sins of Babylon, but you can even find it in 1SG. So the history of 1888, you can find it in Great Controversy. Then we have our own history. So early writing, Great Controversy is equals to our own history. That's why we are using the triple application history. That is why we are using the triple application history. So I'm going to talk about the Civil War that was happening in American churches around 1844. So we have to understand that 1798, when we see William Miller rising, it happened under the Second Great Awakening. So that's when we see William Miller rising into power. So under the Second Great Awakening, the leading master of the Second Great Awakening, it was Charles Finney, who was involved in that, the issue of the Second Great Awakening. So when we look at the external event, what was happening external and also internal, there's a gathering and scattering. So in 1844, there was elections, right? There was elections between, so Clay and Polk, they were fighting, right, for elections. So Clay said something. So I'm gonna read what Henry Clay said. Said the famous Kentucky Senator Henry Clay declared that the church division happening in 1844 were the greatest source of danger to our country. So in 1844, there's a division amongst the churches that were in America. So he's saying that separation, that division is a danger to our country. What happened in the United States was a religious civil war between, what was the religious civil war before? There was a civil war between states, and that religious civil war was fought from 1844 and 1845. So from 1844 up to 1845, there was a religious civil war. So it was fought before that civil war that was fought between North and South. That civil war that was fought between North and South, it was fought in 1861. So the religious and the civil war between the churches, it started before the civil war of the states. So those churches that were fighting, or the division that was happening, it was happening in those churches, the Methodist, Presbyterian, and the Baptist. So these are the largest denomination, the Protestant nation in the United States. So they were fighting over the issue of what? Of slavery. The division was happening in those churches, the Methodist, the Presbyterian, the Baptist. It was happening because of the issue of slavery. So in the 1790s, the Methodists, they tried to excommunicate every slave-owning member of their church. So during 1790s, the Methodists tried to excommunicate every member of their church who is owning a slave. But they had to pull back 6 months later because they saw that it was going to cause the split in their church. So that attempt failed. That attempt failed. So the issue of slavery, it was a big issue during that time, from 1844 going to up to 1845. So I'm gonna read here. Long before cannon fire over Fort Sumter, civil war raged within American churches. 3 of the national largest Protestant denominations were torn apart over slavery or related issue. The Methodist Church split in 1844. So the Methodist Church split in what? In 1844. The Baptist split from the history of 1840 to 1845. So the Baptist from 1840 to 1845 because of the issue of slavery. The Presbyterian Church began to split in 1843 and finished that split in 1844. So from 1843, the Presbyterian up to 1844, there was a split over that issue of church and state. So we have to understand why Ellen G. White, when Ellen G. White talks about the moral fall that was happening in America from 1844. So she wrote about that moral fall that was happening from 1844 in GC 389.2. She says the second angel message of Revelation 14 was first preached in the summer of 1844, and it had a more direct application to the churches of the United States, where the warning of the judgment had been most widely proclaimed and most generally rejected, and where the declension in the churches had been most rapid. But the message of the second angel did not reach its complete, But the message of the second angel did not reach its complete fulfillment in 1844. The churches then in 1844 experienced a moral fall in consequence of their refusal of the light of the Advent message. But that fall was not complete. So what she says here is that the message of the second angel was supposed to be preached in 1844. So the message of the second angel, it says, fallen is what? Fallen is Babylon. So she's saying that the moral fall, it was not complete in 1844 because she's writing that in the book of Great Controversy. She's viewing what happened in 1844, and she said their moral fall, it was progressive. It was not complete because in 1888 we see what the Sunday Law. So it was something that it is progressive. That's what she wrote about that. So if she's not comparing the spiritual experience with the events that are happening outside, she's talking about what is happening inside the church. So she never mentioned what was happening externally concerning the politics. She's talking about the moral fall that was happening inside the church. So when we read 10 MR 96.4. No, let me see. 10 MR 69.1 or 0.1 to 2. So I'm just going to paraphrase that quotation of 10 MR 96.1 to 2. So there's a woman who went to Ellen G. White, visited Ellen G. White. So that woman, she said to Ellen G. White that she thinks that women should vote. The reason why she wants women to vote is because there was a law in Europe that was passed. That law, what was happening in Europe is that when they see a woman, especially the vulnerable one, maybe walking around the street of Europe, they will take that woman and put that woman into a place where men will come and certify themselves with that woman, using that woman as a tool, as an object. So that lady, she said to Ellen G. White, the only reason this law could never, the only reason to stop this, they have to vote. Women has to vote. But when Ellen G. White answered her in point 2, she said to her mind was unprepared for such things. So she said her mind is unprepared to talk about what? To talk about political things, because we have to remember that in 1844, women had no right to vote. They gained a right to vote in 1919 to 1920, if we still remember the study of feminism. The first wave got a right to vote in 1920. So during this time, her mind is not prepared to talk about politics because she's still a woman, and yeah, she doesn't have, I can say that much about politics. So if we want to understand about the politics that were happening during this time, we have to go to A.T. Jones, Uriah Smith, and James White. Those people, they were writing about external events. So Ellen G. White was a woman, she had to play that role of being a woman, not to participate in politics. So what we find here is that her mind was not prepared to talk about politics. And that influenced her writings, because in her writings we can see that she's talking about women playing their role at home, being wives, taking care of kids and all of that, not to participate in politics. So, okay. So what we can see is that when we look at the Protestant, when we look at that civil war in America between South and North, in South, those people who were into slavery were Protestants, right? They were quoting from the Bible that slavery, it was good, because when we look at the ancient Israel, there was slavery, and it is also good to have slaves. So it was Protestants from South who were quoting that. So we see Protestants as what? As bad people. But we can see that when we go deep, we can see that Protestants were also what? good people because they were fighting for what? For slavery. But if we just read on top, we won't see that. So I'm just gonna read few things, then I'm gonna close. So in North, a Presbyterian minister who was a leader in the Second Great Awakening. So this is a leader of a Presbyterian ministry in the Second Great Awakening, Charles Branson Finn. August 29, 1792, he was born. So he was an American Presbyterian minister and leader in the Second Great Awakening. He was called the father of modern revivals. He was best known as being the flamboyant revivalist preacher during particularly the decades from 1825 to 1835 in upstate New York and Manhattan. He was an opponent of old school Presbyterian theology. So this person was a liberal Presbyterian. So he was fighting against those conservative Presbyterian. Together with several other evangelical leaders, and his religious view led him to promote social reform such as anti-slavery and equal education for women and African Americans. So we can see that he was liberal. So he was fighting against slavery, equal education, whether you are a male or female, whether you are white or black. So from 1835, he taught at Oberlin College of Ohio, which accepted students without regard to race or sex. So in that college, students were accepted without race or sex. He served as its second president from 1855 to 1865, during which its faculty and students were activists of abolition and underground railroad and universal education. So we can see that there were Protestants who were liberal, who fought for to abolish slavery and all of that. Not all Protestants were that bad into slavery and that. There were also good Protestants. So yeah, that's what we find about this. So there was a civil war in America from 1844. There was a division in these churches, this largest denomination in America, the Methodist, Presbyterian, and Baptist. So they were fighting over the issue of slavery. So the Methodist, the split started in 1844, the Presbyterian 1843 to 1844, then the Baptist from 1840 to 1855, there was a split. So we can see that, yes, there were good Protestants and also bad Protestants. My study will end here. Is there anyone wants to add something? And we can see that Ellen G. White, during that time, she was supposed to be a woman, right? She had a little information about political events that were happening outside, right? It was A.T. Jones and other pioneers who had that information about what was happening, external. So what she wrote about it was the moral fall, something that is happening internally, not focusing externally. But if she was a male, I believe that we're going to receive a lot of information. But yeah, it was a design of God that she raised her as a prophet for Adventism. God wanted it that way, but we see that, yeah, she doesn't say a lot about politics during that time because the women had not that opportunity to participate in politics. Anyone who wants to add? Hello? Hello? Anyone wants to say something? Karabo. Karabo. Hello? Shamiso.
Hello, Dee.
Yeah, can you close for us with a word of prayer if there's no one wants to add something?
Okay, let us pray. Dear Lord, we want to thank you this afternoon. Want to thank you for the time that you have allowed us to meet via Zoom. And we want to thank you for these truths that you are revealing to us. My prayer is that may you give us eyes that see, and may you give us ears that hear when you speak to us. May you continue to guide us as we study. And we also want to pray for the presenter. May you continue to use her in your work. And may you continue to bless us for the rest of the Sabbath. In Jesus' name I pray with thanksgiving in my heart. Amen.